In this video, we'll talk about executing scope functions in response to user input, or events in AngularJS. The first thing I've done is created a simple array list of items that I will put into my controller. The interesting thing about this declaration is that it's a private variable, items, that is not accessible outside of the controller, and it's not accessible to the user interface or the view as well. So that's kind of nice because you can decide whether or not you want your variable elements to be internal to your controller or exposed outside by attaching them to the scope. Secondly, I'm going to create two values off of the scope, one called scope.itemIndex, which is going to store the numeric value pointing to the specific item in the items array, and scope.currentItem, which will be the string value of the currently selected item. Third, I'm going to create a scope function called getItem. This takes in the current item index on the scope and pulls from the array the correct item in the array and attaches it to scope.currentItem. Now, in order to implement this, we're going to introduce some new attributes in our HTML. The first element is a text input field, and I'm using a new attribute from Angular called ngModel. ngModel is interesting because it creates a two-way data binding between the item index, which is created here in scope.itemIndex, and the input control itself. So whenever the user changes this input control, automatically Angular is going to change scope.itemIndex. Similarly, if Angular, through code in the controller, changes item index, the value of the input control will also automatically change, and we'll see that in a bit. The next step is to add an input button. I'm going to call it getItem, and it has a new Angular attribute called ngClick. ngClick allows users to click on any item that has the tag, and the associated function will be fired. You can put an ngClick on input buttons, divs, A tags, and pretty much anything else that is visible in HTML. The last step in this part is to supply the data binding to the current item. So this is going to display the words current item, and then the current item will change based on user input. So let's run this and see if it works. So now I can input a number, and when I hit getItem, it will change which item I've selected. Similarly, if I type in some bad input, Angular is smart enough to ignore input that doesn't make any sense, and it's not going to generate an error or anything, as you can see. So now the next step is, how do we have Angular do its own manipulation of the scope? Well, we can make use of something that's internal to Angular or built into Angular called interval. And I already have it injected into my controller up on the top. So now I'm just going to copy and paste interval. Interval is a wrapper for setInterval on window. What this is going to do is it's going to, on every 2 seconds, 2000 is 2000 milliseconds, it's going to run this code. And what this is going to do is randomly select an integer value from 0 to 4 and attach it to item index. And we know that item index is data bound to our input box, and it's also data bound to our current item through when it's set. So whenever the interval fires, it's going to call getItem, which will update the current item randomly. So let's run this and see it. And as you can see, changing the index value is changing the input automatically and also changing the current item as well. And that's how you execute functions from user input or events in Angular.